All right, let's go ahead and get into it. Yeah, we're going to go over some AVID basics, buyer cancellations, and disclosing prior reports and repairs. Why are we going over this? Because these came up this past week as questions and or some snags that we hit that I'd just like to share so we can all learn from them and be the best that we can be. So let me check chats real quick. All right, looks like that's all Gary stuff. So first up, Avid 101, a refresher. So if you never really looked at the Avid form and read how to complete it, or maybe you took a stab at it, didn't really do any training on it, we're going to go over a few things and why we have to do this form. So the main reason is it's the law. So agent duty to inspect and disclose when sale of residential property 1 to 4 units. So if you are representing somebody on a residential property 1 to 4 units, a visual inspection is required by law. Who? Brokers representing buyers and sellers. So you have to do one on both sides. If you're the listing side, you have to do one. If you're on the selling, or buyer side, you have to do one. If you are dual agency, you just need to do one. You don't need to do both. Um, what must conduct a reasonably competent and diligent visual inspection of the accessible areas of the property offered for sale. Also must disclose to the prospective buyer material facts and defects that should have been discovered during the inspection. How? An agent completes the TDS and or the AVID form on behalf of the broker. So let's look into that. Forms TDS and AVID. Even though the law that created this obligation did not create a separate form upon which to make the disclosure, a sister law created the Real Estate Transfer Disclosure Statement, known as the TDS. Although most of that form concerns seller disclosure, sections 3 and 5 can be used for the agent to make disclosures. CR created the Agent Visual Inspection Disclosure, the AVID, that alternatively may be used to document the agent's inspection. The AVID is the preferred way to do it, and it's the one I recommend as well. Advantages of the AVID. There are several advantages to using the AVID rather than TDS. First, the AVID offers much more space to disclose room by room sections and that guide the agent through the inspection process. If the AVID is used, the applicable box should be checked on the TDS, which is going to be page 1 of the TDS, section 1. There's 3 little boxes right there, and you're going to check the third one stating that you're attaching an AVID. The other advantage of using the AVID is that the broker's inspection and disclosure obligations apply even when the seller is exempt from completing a TDS. So even if the seller is exempt from TDS, which is not a common thing, you as the agent are still required to complete the AVID. So using the AVID gets agents in the habit of always conducting inspections and making disclosures of residential 1 to 4 properties without being dependent on the TDS. It also shows consistency. If you're just constantly using the same form all the time, filling it out the same way all the time, searching the same things every time, that shows consistency, and that's the kind of things that DRE auditors like to look at is, you have a flow on how you conduct your real estate transactions. Disclosures made after an inspection should be specific but not speculative. Agents should identify only what can be seen. Agents should not guess as to causation, degree of danger, cost of remedial activity, or identify any technical terms. The AVID aids agents in making the legally required disclosures, but also specifies what is outside the scope of agent's duty. For example, there are no statutorily required obligation to search off-site records such as permits, inspect common areas, or gain access to inaccessible areas such as attics or crawl spaces. or look under furniture or carpet, open unlocked doors, or climb onto roofs or into chimneys. So really, you're just walking around the room. What you see is what you write down. Um, what type of property is visual inspection required? Again, residential 1 to 4 and mobile homes. This includes transactions even when exempt from the TDS, such as a probate or REO. Visual inspection is not required on commercial, vacant land, or 5+ residential properties. How do you conduct the visual inspection? An agent must conduct a diligent visual inspection and disclose all facts materially affecting its value or desirability. Above all, the agent should identify red flags such as cracks, stains, discolorations, spots, peeling paint, popcorn ceilings, hillside netting, or uneven or warping floors. Is an agent required to investigate inaccessible areas? That's a no. So we're not going into crawl spaces. We're not going up in the attics. We're not climbing on top of roofs. The inspection is limited to reasonably and normally accessible areas. There's no need to climb up hillsides, onto the roof, or into the attic. Move or look under or behind furniture or into cabinets or open locked doors. So what are the rules of thumb for conducting a visual inspection? These are probably what you really want to focus on here. An attorney once telling me, basically, when you're standing in the room, find something wrong. Is there, a hole in the screen? Is there a scuff on the baseboard? Is there a dent in the wall? Is there a crack above the door? Those are all pretty common things. Those are the things that we're looking for here. Is there discolorations? What do we have going on? So what you want to do is stick to facts. Do not speculate or assume. For example, you may say green and black discoloration in bathroom number 1, but don't say mold of the toxic variety. You don't know if it's toxic, or surface mold. You don't know how deeply it penetrates, or easily cleaned. You don't know exactly what remediation effort is necessary to remove that mold. Or caused by leak in the caulking. You're not offering an opinion as to cause. In fact, it's better not to state mold at all. As an agent, you should not make the determination whether a subject property contains mold or asbestos or other environmental hazards. So you would just simply say there's discoloration behind the toilet, or there is popcorn ceilings, because do they have asbestos or not? We don't know. More than likely, yes. But we're not going to make that determination because we're not testing them. So uh, do not guess as the adequacy of repairs, such as saying repair work looks solid. What if it turns out it's not? Stay away from loose language such as no problems whatsoever. Obviously, there could be, and remodeled all over. I have seen that come up before. Definitely want to stay away from that. Um, really, was it truly remodeled everywhere? Do not attempt to use the visual inspection for marketing or puffery. The house is already sold. All you're doing is making your notes so that you can be in compliance with the law. Stay away from adjectives or size or significance. When identifying cracks, stains, paint, damage, spots, etc., do not attempt to quantify or otherwise describe the size, significance, or degree of a defect. For example, don't say a hairline crack, small crack, or severe crack. Just say that there's a crack. And then where it's at, crack above front door, or crack above, front window and living room. Do not endorse seller statements. Avoid saying, I agree with the seller's portion of the TDS, or make other remarks such as, I do not see anything which contradicts seller's statements. This is your visual inspection and your chance to, uh, present your material facts known on the house. So when does the AVID need to be performed? This is another big one. AVID needs to be performed and delivered accordance to the applicable timelines in the RPA and prior to the release of contingencies. I don't know how many times I see one come across that is done basically, the week of closing or at the same time as the VP. That is not when you do the AVID. The AVID needs to be done prior to the release of contingencies. So this is what we're looking at right here is section 11 of the RPA. So it's 11.2. The transfer disclosure statement required in this paragraph is considered fully completed if seller has completed the section titled Coordination with Other Disclosure Forms by checking a box in section 1, and seller has completed and answered all the forms, yada yada, and the seller's agent, if any, completed and signed the seller's agent section 2, or the agent visual inspection. So they're tying this in with the seller disclosure. So if you're on the listing side, you should be sending your AVID over along with your seller disclosures, and also prior to asking the buyer to release their contingencies. So on the listing side, we're looking at N1. The N section is the seller performance section of the RPA, and you'll see N1, delivery of documents within 7 days after acceptance. So that is the time that you should be delivering the AVID, especially if you're delivering the TDS at that point. Buyer side, we're looking at L3 here. L's are your contingency timelines. By default, everything is 17 days, so just pay attention to what you put in there as a buyer's agent as to when you're going to be releasing contingencies. If you have something in there that is, 3 days for some reason, your AVID needs to be completed prior to that. So just be sure that we are, following those rules with the AVID and not disclosing things, because you would be disclosing material facts late after, if the buyer released the contingencies and then you presented your AVID, that becomes a problem, because you're presenting new material facts. So you're putting your client, especially if you're on the listing side, in a predicament there. Yep, and if you have any questions, you can throw them in the chat as well. We got a little bit of discussion going on in there. So buyer contract cancellation. So why am I going over this one? So, I don't know, late last year, I think it was maybe in the fall, I did a mastering cancellations, this 3-part series. We did it from the listing agent to the seller. We did it, the listing, so the seller canceling, and then we did the buyer canceling. And so I'm going to do a refresher on this one because we had a scenario come up last week where the buyer was canceling. Buyer was canceling in good faith, actually, based on investigation findings. And it was within the timeline of the RPA. They had their 17 days. They were doing it prior. They had tried to negotiate some repairs and credits verbally, got shot down. Listing agent said, all right, it's not going to happen, so send me over the cancellation. The agent sends over the cancellation form, and for the reason they put change of circumstances. And that created a bit of an issue because that is not a provision of the contract to cancel with. You need to specify which contingency you're using when you go to cancel. When you write in there as the agent representing your client, change of circumstances or buyer no longer wants the home, that is not a reason in the RPA to be able to cancel with contingency. So that then puts the buyer in a position where they are canceling not in good faith based on a contingency. They're just backing out. And so that really caused a problem. And we got it rectified, but you don't ever want to say stuff like that. That is not a reason for cancellation. Well, it could be a reason, but it's not a reason provided by the RPA to use contingency and be entitled to your earnest money back. So we don't want to say stuff like that. So let's do a quick refresher. Does a contingency give a buyer an unlimited right to cancel? It does not. It's important to understand that a contingency does not give a buyer an unlimited right to cancel for any reason at all. Where the buyer, for example, cancels on the basis of inspection contingency, the reason for canceling must be related to a matter pertaining to the condition of the property and must be in good faith. And it says in the contract must be in good faith too. So that really that gets scrutinized when disputes arise. Was it made in good faith or not? Indeed, whenever a buyer cancels on the basis of any contingency, the reason for the cancellation must relate to that contingency and must be in good faith. Additionally, a buyer cannot cause his or her own contingency to fail. This is, in fact, one definition of bad faith, and there are others. So, what's the example? If the buyer makes no effort to provide the lender with the proper information required for a loan, the buyer will not be able to obtain the loan. The buyer then cancels on the basis of the loan contingency. This would likely be a breach since the buyer's own actions caused the contingency to fail. This would be both a breach of the contract's requirement in paragraph 8A of the RPA, that the buyer make a diligent effort to obtain the designated loan and a use of the contingency in bad faith. So right here in section 8, you can see it says right here, if contingent, buyer shall act diligently and in good faith. I mean, they say that quite often through the RPA if you have ever read through it. Example, the buyer has removed all contingencies with the exception of the loan contingency. Suppose a lender approves a loan that the buyer was seeking, but the buyer chooses not to accept it. Can the buyer cancel on the basis of the loan contingency? That'd be a no. The buyer actually was able to obtain the loan, and therefore the contingency has been satisfied. The buyer's cancellation would be a breach. Under what circumstances may a buyer cancel based upon the appraisal contingency? The RPA states that the contract is contingent upon a written appraisal by a licensed or certified appraiser of the property at no less than the purchase price, or if lowered, indicated in paragraph 302. So in 302, if you wrote in something here, then that would be the amount. Otherwise, it's whatever the final purchase price is. The property doesn't appraise at the purchase price, and the buyer may cancel based upon this appraisal contingency, and the buyer would be entitled to the return of the deposit. Good faith generally doesn't come into play here since the buyer has little control over the appraiser or appraisal process. The appraisal comes in low, the buyer simply has a right to cancel. However, the buyer did improperly influence the appraiser to obtain a low appraisal in order that the buyer might cancel. This would qualify as bad faith on the part of the buyer, as well as violating some other laws. In such circumstances, the buyer's cancellation will likely be a breach. Under what circumstances may a buyer cancel based upon the loan contingency? RPA states, sorry, not that I was repeating myself, I'm not. The RPA states that the buyer shall act diligently and in good faith to obtain the designated loan or loans, paragraph 8A. So we're looking at the grid section of the purchase agreement. This is page 1 of the purchase agreement, actually. So the buyer is to obtain a conventional loan not to exceed 5.5 fixed rate and not to exceed 1 point. So this is the loan contingency. If they apply for something other than this and get denied, they would not be able to use their loan contingency to cancel the purchase. So if the buyer, after making good faith and diligent effort to obtain such a loan, is not approved, then they may cancel the agreement without being held in breach of the contract. What does it mean in this context to make good faith and diligent effort? The answer is not always going to be clear. However, an example of possible bad faith would be if the buyer has not provided a complete loan application after being asked for one, or if the buyer has intentionally failed to provide requested documents to the lender, or perhaps the buyer told the lender falsely that they had lost their job. If the buyer engaged in any of those actions, and cancellation based upon the loan contingency may be a breach of the contract. Another example of a failure to act diligently and in good faith to obtain the designated loan is where the buyer never sought to obtain a loan at 5.5%. Let's say the buyer only sought out loans at 4.5%. Clearly, then the buyer could not cancel on the basis of the loan contingency because they never made any effort to obtain the designated loan, which was what was written here in E1, page 1 of the RPA. So that is the exact loan that they need to be applying for. All right, so should the financing selection or section indicating the interest rate and points be filled out? I see probably very few contracts come across with this section filled out actually on both sides, whether we're on the listing side or the buying side. Usually I just see the loan amount in there and not the others. I even see it counted out sometimes by listing agents. So yes, this is an important part of the loan contingency, pertains to the buyer making good faith and diligent effort to obtain the designated loan. This protects the buyer by making it clear exactly what type of loan the buyer should be trying to obtain. When the contract is specific, then the buyer will be able to cancel with greater confidence if they are unable to obtain the loan. If the section is left blank, then it will be unclear when the buyer may use the loan contingency to cancel. Does it mean the buyer must take any loan they are offered, no matter how bad, in order to cancel on the basis of the loan contingency? Or does it mean the buyer need only to make a diligent effort to obtain any reasonably priced loan? It's unclear, and the failure to fill out this section can lead to unnecessary disputes. Quick note, the most recent revisions of the RPA do not require the buyer to fill in the section regarding points. Merely by leaving it blank, the buyer is indicating that the loan they are seeking will be with 0 points. If the buyer is offered a loan on the terms as designated in the RPA, but then objects to other terms such as prepayment penalty, can the buyer cancel? The answer depends. So in the case of Robertson versus Dodson, a judge stated that when an agreement to sell real property is silent on the details of the terms of financing, the usual and standard terms of a note and deed and trust must be accepted by the buyer. Specifically, in that case, the judge stated that the buyer had no right to reject a loan on the basis of that the note contained an acceleration clause. However, the judge speculated that the buyer might be able to reject a note on the basis of compound interest, since that custom or usage was not well known in the community, end quotes. So the answer here is that it may be possible for a buyer to reject financing because of certain terms and then cancel on the basis of a loan contingency if the terms are not common terms of a typical mortgage. It is not clear what terms might fit within that definition. If a buyer would like to reject a loan based on certain provisions, such as a prepayment penalty, and then cancel on the basis of the loan contingency, they just should advise a client to speak with an attorney. Or you can write that into your contract if you think there might be one. Most loans do not have them, but if they are applying for a type of loan, such as a DSCR loan or something like that, where they are common or typically built in, you have to pay to not have the prepayment, then you may want to put that in your contract. I'm gonna check some chat real quick. Yes, we can get a copy of these 14 pages. All right. So what is the rule for cancellation based upon an inspection contingency? The inspection contingency is the broadest contingency. As outlined in paragraph 12 of the RPA, it includes a wide range of inspections. Additionally, the incorporation of the buyer's inspection advisory, the BIA, into paragraph 12 further broadens the scope of the inspection contingency. So This is what section 12 looks like of the RPA. You can see, it's this is one of the larger sections in here, and it gives a whole slew of inspections that the buyer can obtain. But what makes the inspection contingency especially broad is that both the law and the contract give the buyer wide latitude to exercise the inspection contingency based on good faith assessment of the condition and any other matter affecting the property. Case law expands the buyer's rights even further by allowing that the buyer may exercise the contingency to cancel the contract based upon the buyer's own subjective standard of which conditions are satisfactory and which are not. Nonetheless, there is still a limiting factor to any buyer's decision to cancel must always be in good faith, meaning that the buyer's reason for cancellation must generally be based upon either a condition of the property or some other matter affecting the property. This can also be a nuisance in the neighborhood. So, if you're showing the home and, I don't know, the neighbors outside, they have a garage band or something, making all kinds of noise out there. Buyers end up, getting the property, and that's just continually going on and on again. And they decide that they can't deal with that, is going to be a nuisance. There has been case law with that as well. And that actually should be disclosed on the seller side, if there's neighborhood nuisances. What are specific examples of what might constitute a proper reason for canceling under an inspection contingency? The buyer can cancel based on an inspection contingency for any reason in which they are truly dissatisfied. There are many possible reasons for cancellation, including a pest inspection, comes back indicating that Section 1 work must be done, or where Megan's Law database shows a sex offender living nearby, or the roof needs repair work. These are all matters that could affect the desirability of this property. Practice pointer, if at all possible, the buyer should not rely upon a single factor as a reason for canceling under the inspection contingency. Generally, most buyers have more than one reason for not liking the property. And the cases that discuss inspection contingencies mention a multiplicity of factors that must be considered when evaluating a broad inspection contingency. So it's best for the buyer to not focus on any single factor as a basis for their cancellation, as a basis for their dissatisfaction. However, it is clearly a single overriding factor when the buyer's cancellation will still be proper as long as the buyer is genuinely and in good faith dissatisfied. And to clear that up, well, actually, we'll go here. So is the buyer required to specifically state the reason for the cancellation? And that's no. So they may have a multitude of reasons. They may have one reason, whatever it is. That's not what we're putting on the cancellation form. We're just referencing which contingency we're using to cancel in good faith. So we don't want to put down, a whole bunch of things. Oh, seller didn't like the plumbing report that came back, or the age of the roof was older than they thought. Like we're not putting those down here. We're referencing, it says right here, as permitted by good faith exercise of paragraphs 8 and 12 of the agreement. So we're not giving the reasons, we're saying what paragraph we're using to cancel. So, and that's where, our agent got into a predicament, is because right here in 1A1, they put change of circumstances, and that is not a provision in the RPA for the buyer to use to cancel out. So, nowhere in the contract or law is the buyer required to immediately state the exact reasons they are canceling. Therefore, if the buyer wishes to cancel on the basis of an inspection contingency, then the buyer can indicate as a reason for canceling paragraphs 8 and 12 of the RPA, which reference a buyer's right to cancel without going into specifics. Ultimately, however, the buyer should have his or her reasons. If there is a dispute over the deposit, then a mediator, arbitrator, or judge may demand to know why the buyer canceled, and the buyer should then be able to fully explain his or her reasons. Also, you're probably going to need those reasons to tell the listing agent why you're canceling. Is a buyer guaranteed to get the deposit back when he or she properly canceled the contract in good faith based on the contingencies? And this is important. So we want to steer clear of saying you'll get your money back if you cancel, because the cancellation is two parts. It's part one and part two. Part one is the cancellation of the contract, meaning we're canceling the purchase. Boom. That does not mean escrow is canceled. That means the contract is canceled. Part two is the disposition of the earnest money deposit, and that is where escrow will cancel once that earnest money is released to whichever party it's going to be released to. And then they will cancel out escrow. So you can have a canceled purchase, but not a canceled escrow. So that's important to understand that those are two different things. So if you are canceling section one, you're going to put, 8 and 12 in there for the reason canceling. And then section two of the cancellation, you're going to say, you want the earnest money released back to the buyer. Well, if that is sent over to escrow, then the purchase is canceled and escrow is awaiting the disposition of the earnest money. What are they going to do with it? Is there going to be a dispute? Is it they giving it back to the buyer? Is the seller going to agree? The seller must agree to section two in order for the earnest money to be released. Now, if the seller is saying, I think you're canceling in bad faith, then the earnest money, and then they're disputing the earnest money. So if you've made that promise that you're going to get your earnest money back, that can come back on you as the agent for saying that. Now, it doesn't mean that they're not entitled to it. And that's the words that I use. I say you're entitled to your earnest money back, but it takes both parties to sign that section two part to release the earnest money back. So we need to be careful with our words when we're talking about release of earnest money in cancellations. But I think I saw a few come in here, two questions. Yeah, Manny, it's a good tip to be mindful because a seller could say, I'll replace that roof or I'll get that system fixed, which may create a dispute as to the good faith nature of the cancellation because the seller is willing to address the buyer's cancellation objection. Another question, what if the buyer got laid off? Is that a part of the loan contingency? It could be, yes, because they cannot obtain a loan, most likely, or at least not the loan that they're going for without employment. So more than likely, they're going to get a denial from the lender, in which case you should get that in writing from the lender so that you have a copy of it when you when you go to cancel your contract. So, all right. So is a buyer guaranteed to get deposit back when they properly canceled in good faith on the contingencies? No, keep in mind that if there is a dispute over the deposit, there's a good chance that a judge in small claims court or an arbitrator will make the determination as to who is in the right, who is in the wrong. Small claims court judges are not necessarily knowledgeable about real property or contract law, and even if they are, they might not care to strictly adhere to the law, either depending on their sympathies or the particular facts of the case. Also, it's quite possible that a judge just might decide that the buyer's reasons are in fact in bad faith, simply because the judge does not believe the buyer's testimony. So practice pointer, do not provide assurances to your client that they will receive the earnest money deposit back. We're going to do our best. We're canceling in good faith. We're stating the reason or the provisions of the contract, the paragraphs of the contract that we're using to cancel. And we had some adverse findings. So that's what we're armed with. And then we need to basically, I guess, convince the seller that these are the reasons and they're in good faith. Therefore, you are entitled, you are required to return the earnest money back to us. You may explain that under the terms of the contract, the buyer has broad inspection contingency rights, pointing to paragraph 8C, that states the contract is contingent on the buyer's acceptance of the condition of and any other matter affecting the property. See paragraph 12. But ultimately, if there's a dispute, a judge or arbitrator may decide the issue. No one can ever guarantee how any particular case will be decided. One only has to look at the many high-profile court cases to see that decisions do not always go the expected way. So any questions on cancellations at all? You can throw them in the chat, or if you want to raise your hand, you can ask live as well. Look if we have any other ones. So we can go on to disclosure of prior reports and repairs. So I think a couple weeks ago, I showed, maybe it was in the Facebook group, I don't remember. Anyways, at some point, I shared a little news article that came out that said it was about 35% of the homes that sold in 2025 actually were sold to investors. And you can imagine what percentage of those were actually flips. And so this is important if you're dealing with those types of properties, or if you're dealing with a scenario where the buyer has recently purchased the property, and I don't know, they had a life event happen or something like that, and they are now selling it, quickly. So let's go over these real quick. The basic rule of disclosure states that the agent and the seller have the duty to disclose material facts affecting the value or desirability of the property that are not known to or within the diligent attention and observation of the buyer. This sounds straightforward, but it's often difficult to know whether a fact is material or within the diligent attention of the buyer. For this reason, the car purchase agreements add clarity and detail to the disclosure obligation by going beyond the common law rule and requiring the disclosure of prior reports and repairs by contract. So if you're using the car RPA, these are by contract. What types of repairs need to be disclosed? So the RPA contractually obligate the seller to disclose repairs through the seller property questionnaire, the SPQ, which asks questions specifically about repairs and alterations to the property and clarifies what is included. Paragraph 7 of the SPQ asks the seller to disclose any alterations, modifications, replacements, improvements, remodeling, or material repairs on the property, as well as any ongoing maintenance, including any portion of the property that's paid within the past 12 months. So this is really broad. I mean, they're covering kind of everything here, meaning if you know anything about the property, you need to be, checking yes on this property, or on this report right here. Paragraph 5 of the SPQ requires that the seller deliver a copy of all documents in their possession regarding the condition or repair of the property, including any past or proposed improvements. So if they had planned on building an ADU, maybe they went through some process on it, whatever they have needs to be turned over, even if they didn't end up building that ADU, or maybe they were going to put an addition on or something like that. All that stuff would need to be turned over to the new buyer. So the documents is defined broadly and clearly and includes any prior reports the seller possesses. And just so you know, the SPQ by contract is required anytime a TDS is required. So if you are selling a property with a TDS and you're using the car purchase agreements, which you should be, the SPQ is going to be a requirement by contract. And this is where we have all of this disclosure law in here. So Do previous defects have to be disclosed if they have already been repaired? Answer is yes. Even if a past problem or defect has since been repaired, it is still a material fact that must be disclosed. That's within the definition of repair. Problems can reoccur. Buyers should know what to look out for in the future, especially if we're dealing with plumbing issues. For example, if a water leak was repaired, the area may still be prone to moisture or mold issues, and a buyer should be aware of the repair history, both to monitor any related problems. Disclosure of past defects, even if they've been fixed, demonstrates good faith and may prevent future allegations of misrepresentation or claims against a seller for failure to disclose. So there is no timeline on this stuff. If it happened, check yes, fill out the SPQ stating what happened and how it was remedied. What reports must sellers and agents provide? Does this include past inspection reports in the seller's possession regarding the property's condition? That's a yes. The disclosure requirement in paragraph 5 of the SPQ is extremely broad. The SPQ specifically requires sellers to address any reports, inspections, disclosures, warranties, maintenance recommendations, estimates, studies, surveys, or other documents pertaining to the condition or repair of the property. SPQ also instructs sellers to provide copies of all such documents in their possession to the buyer, not just summaries or excerpts. It's important to understand and convey to our clients that there is no limitation on how far back in time documents must be produced. That means that all documents in possession of the seller or the seller's agent, whatever their age, must be disclosed to the buyer. There is no materiality standard. It's not left to the seller's discretion to determine whether a document given is material. All documents regarding the property should be copied and disclosed. So what they're saying is anything they have in their possession needs to be turned over to the buyer. If they have old manuals and, whatever, warranties, and like I said, permits, work orders, all that stuff, turn it over. This includes if you have it as well. Does a disclosure have to be made no matter how long ago the repair took place or how old the document is? Yes, there is nothing in paragraph 7 of the SPQ limiting the disclosure requirement based on how long ago a repair was made. The paragraph requires disclosure of material repairs, but sellers should not attempt to determine whether a repair is material. If the seller is aware of a past repair or still possesses a report, regardless of how much time has passed, this information should be disclosed to the buyer. The obligation to disclose does not expire simply because an event occurred years ago. Even older repairs may reveal recurring problems or provide important context about the property's condition and history. It's important to recognize that the usefulness of older reports or documents may diminish over time. Buyer's agent should review the dates of any reports, disclosures provided, and advise buyers of the information is significantly outdated. Just about done here. And again, if you have any questions on these, go ahead and toss them in the chat. We'll cover them at the end. What if the transaction does not require SPQ or TDS? For TDS exempt transactions in which neither the SPQ nor TDS is required, the car purchase agreements will typically require the seller to provide an exempt seller disclosure. That's Form ESD. This form requires the seller to disclose whether they are aware of any other material fact or defect affecting the property or material documents in the seller's possession affecting the property. The ESD's much vaguer standard reflects the common law basic rule of disclosure quoted in the first paragraph of this article. Nonetheless, an agent's advice to the seller will essentially be the same with or without the SPQ relying on the basic rule of thumb. When in doubt, disclose, disclose, disclose. We've all heard that one. Which will effectively require the seller to disclose all repairs, all material documents, as though they were answering questions on the SPQ. Now, here's the fun part. So, do real estate licensees have to keep documents relating to the property? What about property owners? All right, so yes and no. Real estate licensees must retain transaction records for at least 3 years after closing, as required by the Department of Real Estate. This means that if an agent assisted a client in purchasing a property and is now listing that property within 3 years, all documents from the purchase should still be in the agent's possession and must be disclosed as part of the transaction. Property owners, on the other hand, are not legally required to keep reports or transaction documents. However, if a seller retains any property records and reports, they must also be disclosed as part of the transaction. So if you are relisting a property that you sold to somebody 3 years or less ago, the reports should be in your possession. They should be turned over. If a listing agent or seller has an inspection report paid for by a previous buyer, must they disclose it, even if the report says it is used only by the person for whom it was repaired? So this is not an excuse to not provide a previous inspection. So many inspection reports contain language limiting their use to the person who paid for the inspection or stating that the report is non-transferable. This language is there to protect the inspector and let third parties know that they should not expect to have claims against the inspector for any reason. Such disclaimers do not make the report confidential. And once it is in the possession of the seller or listing agent, it must be disclosed to any subsequent buyers of the property. Lastly, does the seller have to seek reports that are not in their possession if they know or believe they exist? Answer is no. Sellers are not required to provide copies of reports in their or their agent's possession. Sellers do not need to verify the status of permits or obtain reports or invoices for past repairs. Their requirement to disclose applies only to documents the seller has on hand. So they don't have to go and contact companies and see if they have a copy of, the work that was done and things like that. It's what they have on hand. So they don't have to go searching around for all this stuff, making all these calls, calling down to the city, things like that. It's what they have on hand. So, and same thing for us, what we have on hand. So hopefully that provides a little bit of clarification. Is the TDS required with rental properties? If you're renting the property then no. If you're selling the property that has been a rental, yes. And you would check on that the seller is not occupying the property. But if you are representing a rental property owner who is renting the property out, no. That has their own little disclosure. It's the RPOD, which is part of the listing, the lease listing agreement. Another question, one for each unit or the entire property. So I had this question come up, and this is why I actually brought this up. It says on the TDS it may be used for all or can be filled out per unit. My recommendation on it in that particular scenario that had come up was that the owner had purchased this fairly recently, actually. They renovated a lot of, it was a 4-unit. They renovated each of the units pretty extensively. And so my recommendation was to fill out a TDS and SPQ for each of the units because they had done so much renovation on each one of them that there was a lot of knowledge. Not every unit had the exact same thing going on, and there was a lot of work done. So it was my opinion that it was best to do one for each unit in that scenario. Now, if you've got a whatever, a two unit that somebody's owned for a really long time and they've really not done much work on it, basically kind of a bum landlord or whatever you want to call it, and they've only done a couple things here and there, well, maybe you can get away with just filling out one, but being specific on the units, unit A had a blown water heater, got replaced. Unit B had a water leak behind, the tub and shower, fixed leak, repaired shower surround, So you have to be specific on uh, what unit you're referring to. So while it's more paperwork to do one for each unit, it could be a little clearer to do it that way. But if you're not dealing with a whole slew of renovations and repairs and stuff like that, then maybe you could get away with just doing the one for, all the units. Like I said, if there hasn't been, maybe ownership was short or there hasn't been much work done to it or hardly anything, you could probably get away with just one then. So I would make that assessment. Don't let the paperwork determine your how much you're going to disclose, or same thing with your clients. Just because they have to fill out, or you're recommending that they fill out, you know uh, one of these for each unit because of how much work has been done. This is for their benefit. This is showing that they are being as upfront as possible with their disclosure of their units. So that's my recommendation on that. um, I think I got all the questions in here. So if you ever need a copy of the meetings, they are in our back office. There's a training and motivation tab. Click that. All the past recordings are there. We're also including the documents there as well. You can also email Roxanne if you want to get a copy, info@riserealtyca.com if you want a copy of the PDF. It's actually a Google Doc um, on any of these meetings that we do, like these that are kind of more on the training side. So um, other than that, if you missed it in the beginning, yes, I'm going to be in New York next week at the Inman Connect conference. That'll be all week. Um, we'll probably have a guest speaker for Monday's meeting, and I'll still have my phone on me and all that. So if you have any questions, obviously call or text. But other than that, hope everybody has a great week, and give us a call if you need anything, and we'll talk to you soon.